Let the word go
The
forth.
challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a pioneering program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
That looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of shared values.
For something real.
60 years later, we examine our divisions, our connections, our shared pains and successes in a new program called Challenge 2.0. Last week, we began an examination of Black history, the efforts to marginalize or even eliminate it from some school curricula. This week, we're going to continue that conversation and consider why Black students aren't the only ones to lose if all cultures aren't taught or learned. So I'd like to welcome, and not for the first time, because we had this conversation in last week's episode, but the first time we've had two siblings on this program, and we couldn't ask for two better guests on this issue of the efforts to rewrite or eliminate Black history and what we lose as a people. So I'd like to welcome Gene Cash, who has been a teacher and a principal and a coach, and he is here where I am also in Sammamish, Washington. And one of the beauties of Zoom is that we can bring people from diverse areas of the country or even the world, as we've done. And so we have with us also Dr. Kreiner Cash, who has served as superintendent of schools in a number of major school districts and has been a reformer that has achieved great changes on that. So Kreiner and Gene, I thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Let me begin, and for those that weren't part of the conversation last week, begin with, as you were immersed in your careers, what did you witness in terms of the cost of not having an adequate understanding of Black history for your students, for the public at large? And when you seek to change that, what changes did you see in your students? And whichever one of you would like to begin with that. I think, Gene, I think we ended with Kreiner last week. Perhaps we could begin with you on that question in this week's episode.
Well, personally, I think the curriculum is the key to success for all students. And a lack of curriculum makes students fail. 50 years, no, about 60 years ago, I closed down my campus with 4 others because we looked at the curriculum and it was not representative of African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Asians and other groups, but we were looking at African Americans. And so what we did was make it real simple, go in and the administration building, put chains around it, told the custodians to get out. And we held the building. Then 6 months later, we had a College of Ethnic Studies to enforce the curriculum that we wanted and thought that the students needed. Mm-hmm. Not only African Americans, but white students, Asian students need to be corrected. And I think when you look at that, and I'll just jump ahead a little bit. Right before George Floyd, I was invited to speak at the first annual Black Student Union to speak to them. And they had about 100 students there. And my thing was Black Lives Matter, but it matters all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that was my theme. And so it wasn't because of me, but 2 weeks later, they went up and demanded a change in a lot of the curriculum. You know, because I told them, look at your curriculum. Are you representing to it? You're representative, but is it deep? Is it understanding? Does it mention not just a paragraph on slavery, but why was there slavery economically?
Mm-hmm.
You know, who was hurt in slavery? 4,000 people were lynched. You know, are they talking about that? Why? What are the causes? You know, what's going to happen in the future? And so when they looked at the curriculum, they made some changes at my college. And that's the key, you know, looking at it. And it hurts when you're a student, like when I was a student, and you don't see yourself represented properly, or you don't see yourself represented with the suffering that had gone on in the past. Because if you don't understand the past, then mistakes will happen again.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it should not be forgotten, because we want students to be engaged. We want them to have critical thinking, not just read a headline, you know, or what's going on. For instance, the book club I started at my church, which is, mostly white, because my wife and I live in communities that look different than us. And there was a purpose behind that. And I'll just go through this real quickly, some of the books that we've read and discussed, because it's important. Warmth of Many Suns, The New Jim Crow, Poverty by America, Half American, Social Justice Through Poverty, Project 1619, From Slave to Priest, et cetera, on those different books, because I think other cultures need to know what's inside my home, what we're studying. And that does not happen.
Reiner, what's been your experience with that then?
Well, one of the things I want to emphasize is that everybody has a story. I've learned that over 45 years in my professional career. And I enjoy so much talking to people and learning what their story is. Tell your story. Everybody has a fascinating and worthwhile story. And so I became attuned to wanting people, especially my students and their families, to share their stories, because I felt that was a strategy to begin to help other people open up to them and begin to first hear and then appreciate who their students were, for example. Most of the districts I was the CEO in or the superintendent in were majority minority districts. In other words, mostly African Americans who were poor, Black and brown children also, and then my white students were the minority. But then we had 86% of our teachers were white, and they were coming from different backgrounds and places, not usually the city, usually the suburbs, in to teach our students. So I knew I needed to do a whole lot with our teaching staffs and even our administrative staffs, everyone. So I put everyone through different kinds of training, for example, so that we would be able to first learn, understand, and then teach better. But we had to first respect and appreciate the kids who were in front of us. And I thought if I made a district-wide project out of developing and writing oral histories. And we found so many fascinating information, and the kids were so proud, and there's so many tears flowing when these kids got up and spoke not only to their teachers, but to the community, because we invited the community in to hear and listen and even judge some of the academic projects that we were doing. We call it Think Show. So long story short, when you start to listen to people, and I've traveled all over the world. I've had the good fortune of being able to travel all over the world and speak to anybody and everybody I could to see what I could learn. And when you start really listening to people and hearing people's stories, that to me is the connector. That's the connector. That's the connector today. I don't agree with ABC. Gene and I will get in trouble if we even start talking about it. But what I do want to do is I want to hear your stories. I want to sit with you and let you go first. And I want to hear your family story. I want to know where you came from, who your ancestors are. What are your pride points in your family? What are your pride points within you and yourself and your marriage and who your children are? And then let's see if there's some common ground there. And I'll bet you there's more common ground. That's what I've learned anyway. Then there are these very vitriolic differences that come out because we're only listening and hearing what we want to listen and hear. And it's really not even a primary source. It's usually a secondary or tertiary source. And the best sources in history, and that's why I was alluding to those great Black scholars, they look only mainly at primary source material because that's where the story is.
In the episode that we did last week, we had a discussion about ancient African civilizations. We want to move next into the slavery era, and I would ask each of you to maybe offer a couple of examples of stories that came out of that era that typically get suppressed, that do not get passed on, that you think are imperative for everyone to know.
It's really difficult to talk about it because it's close to home,
Mm-hmm.
to both of us. And when you look at it, the economic benefit for a major part of the country, that's why it went on and on and on. And when I look at slavery, I find that other countries abolished it before, Britain, before the US did, quote unquote. And then all of a sudden, the Jim Crow laws came into effect, Reconstruction and all of that came into effect. But slavery broke away families. It was difficult. Here you are with your mate or your kids and they're gone to another plantation or whoever bid the highest. Would do it. It was a horrible, horrible event. And I think current, when we look at, we were at the March on Washington. It was for other things, but it was not safe for to abolish slavery, quote unquote, that was abolished. But when we look at slavery, I had an article 30 years ago about low wages in America. Is that a continuation of quote unquote slavery? I looked at redlining in housing. I look at gentrification, what's going on right now. Where African American, the central area in Seattle was 70% African American in the 70s. That's part of slavery. Now it's down to 7% because of the high taxes. And that's happening across the whole nation. And so we look at slavery, of course, but it's a continuation in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
But it's slavery to me, and it's still going on. But you have to move on with what your ideas are and continuous. Like our dad said, one time he said to me, and I'll close, I said, I can't do this. And he said, there's no such word as can't. There's no such word as can't. And I still believe that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's right, Gene. That's right. Only do. We were taught only do. I have maybe 2 main points to make around that issue that I think others are maybe trying to suppress, but all of this is related.
Mm-hmm.
All of it goes back to the origin of and the premise that if you in fact had a people of African origin that actually initiated and developed the first civilization,
Mm-hmm.
that was a glorious civilization, if you believe that to be true, then you also, if you're trying to perpetuate white supremacy and white racism, that's the origin of it. Because if that's true, then all the other things we've learned from Greek civilization as being the first civilization,
Mm-hmm.
and knowledgeable civilization, Greco-Roman civilization, on to the present time, 500 years of history and scholarship, mainly promulgated by white male historians, you see. Now you have a conflict. And so I don't want to be caught up in that web where we're always sort of at conflict and feeling, awful and all of that kind of thing. I simply want to be about teaching what the truth is. Teach what the truth is. And if you're educated well enough, with enough discipline in your content matter, then you can scratch out and figure out and hash out what the truth is for yourself. My father never said, this is the truth, this, and this. He said, you're going to have to figure that out yourself. And there's room for plenty of dialogue and discourse and disagreement within that conversation. And that's what we need to do, essentially, with all cultures, all peoples, all ethnicities. Let's sit down and scratch this out. I don't want to sit over here and argue with people who already know, preaching to the choir, so to speak. I really do want to sit down with you and talk. And I want my kids to sit down with you. I want you to see how brilliant my kids are and how they will respond in debate because of the education that I've been able to give them in the places that I was leading. Great culturally responsive teaching and learning initiatives in Buffalo Public Schools. And so when you look at the programs that we brought to Memphis and to Buffalo, for example, that were designed to increase knowledge, particularly of Black history, and to be more culturally responsive to indigenous peoples, people of Hispanic origin, pan-Hispanic origin, and of course, Black and even Asian cultures, which were beginning to come into our school system, then that was what we were trying to do. We weren't trying to exclude or trying to say that this culture or history is more important than this one, but this one absolutely has been neglected, and it continues to be neglected and distorted and flat out falsehoods told about it. So the notion, for example, that African Americans and slaves who were slaves benefited in any kind of way whatsoever from being slaves is outrageous. And that has to be mitigated. That has to be challenged, and that has to be educated accurately and truthfully about. But at this point, I'll just suffice it to say that effort to educate staff who teach our children, to educate parents who have said to us, thank you for teaching me more about my history, because we provided parent workshops and parent conferences and settings where they could learn. And then the kids who told their parents, who told me and others on this. We had some wonderful, magnificently talented educators teaching this curriculum. They said, my son was never so interested in school as he is now. My daughter never so interested in school as she is now. And so that up early, can't wait to get to school, can't wait to get back onto their projects, you see. And again, I could go into great detail about it and exciting examples, but this is what it means. We live in a pluralistic society, Jeff. We live in the most diverse world now than we've ever lived in. There are no really much anymore pure races, 100% this, 100% that. We're integrated. So we have multiracial, biracial, multi-ethnic children and people all in our school system today, all over the world today. We just crossed 8 billion in world population. There's more mixtures and admixtures than ever before. So you have to teach this because that's what makes up the school and the kids that are before you. So that is what we were trying to do. That's the fulcrum and the momentum behind all of this, is to make sure that the children have books and curriculum that reflect who they are, what they know.
What do white students miss out on when all they are exposed to is what we might class as white history?
I think, when you look at that, most students, and it's sad, even students of color, they know who George Washington, they know Ben Franklin, they know about the history of our presidents. Obama, of course, was a person of color, but they don't know Frederick Douglass, Marcus Garvey, and other people like that. Years ago, I talked to Kreiner, and I did a little research on it, and he said there's only 3 things to make students get together. He called it the 3 A's: attitude, academics, and attendance. And so this pin here is from the PTSA gave to me, because what I would do, I'd go to their homes. The kid wasn't at school after 3 days. I'm just going to go to your home. And then they'd run to school because they didn't want Mr. Cash coming to their house. You know? But, you know, when I look at the 3 A's, it's impossible not to succeed. I found even with the poorest student academically, if he's at school, making an effort, of course, I'd walk around, you know, because as a teacher, I never failed a student because they would be with me starting March. You know who's going to fail. They don't know this stuff because I would be with them. They're with me after school. They can't play baseball, no spring sports. After a week, they're up to par. You know, with Mr. Cash, they're up to par. And some of the kids would say, why do I have to learn this? And I would say, why do I have to learn your history? We need to learn each other's history. It's very important because you're going to be working one day for a woman, a person of color, a person of gender, of sex related, or vice versa. They're going to be working for you. So how do you have that relationship with someone who is different? So you have to be prepared to understand that relationship. And I would have in my cafeteria 80 different flags of all the countries their parents came from or where they were born up in the cafeteria. So they could say, oh, that's where granddad was born. That's where mom was born. You know, so they could respect that culture. And I would say to the students that you don't have to go to the pizza party on Saturday with each other, but while we're in this environment, we're going to learn to respect each other. So as you get older, you might invite that person to their house. Because I know my wife, growing up in Renton, the largest high school in the state, it's changed in color, but she was the only, growing up, the only Black in her classes. You know, growing up, her dad had 5 acres. And she said she felt disappointed. She never got invited to a party, never went to the prom, you know, and things like that. And times have changed, as Kreiner was saying, the cultures are moving all over. And so we must respect that culture. But we have to fight back and we have to have action. You know, we have to have action in doing.
Well, to tie this to this whole theme here about Black history and what happens when you don't learn the full scale of your history, what are the impacts of that? They're significant. They're significant impact. And so what you have to do is you do have to be very intentional. And what efforts have been made to ignore that, to erase that, to distort that, is because of who has written and who's been in charge of these curriculum content. The curriculum content. So when a white child or a white person says, and I believe he says it with all intent and seriousness, well, what about white history? Well, that's all we're learning. That is all we have learned for the past 500 years. It has been written mostly by white males, but largely by white people, whether from Italy or France or you know, Ireland or England or wherever the European histories and ethnicities linked to. Those folks have controlled the curriculum, the knowledge dissemination in all of the social sciences, in mathematics, in history, in science, in technology now. When you learn art, what art are you learning about? When you take music class in school, what music are you singing about and learning about? So I don't understand what about white history question. It is the undergirding curriculum in pre-K to 12 education, in higher education, graduate education. It's everywhere. And so what we're simply trying to do is do a little salt and pepper and shake some of what these other cultures and ethnicities that live in this great country and have built this country and have helped it be prosperous today. Let us have some space in the curriculum where you can also learn authentically about us as well. That's what's being requested. And I think that's a fair request.
And that expands our sense of not only who we are, but also what we can be. That's one of the benefits of travel. And essentially, we're traveling through the classroom.
That's right.
This has been just such a rich conversation, and I thank you both so very much about this. And we related this also to the issue of what's available in terms of histories and books. And so we're very fortunate that both Gene and Kreiner are going to be part of our next challenge episode, and that is dealing with this issue of book bans. But right now, in these 2 episodes we've done on recovering erased histories, I just say thank you so much, Gene, and thank you so much, Kreiner. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Jeff.
So to all of you that are watching or listening, we hope you'll join us again next week on the next episode of Challenge 2.0, where you'll be treated to more conversation with both of these gentlemen. Thank you again. If you've enjoyed this program, found our conversations to be informative, entertaining, and thought-provoking, and the vision inspiring of people from different backgrounds who can disagree without being disagreeable, perhaps you might consider supporting our program with a contribution. Your support will not only help our program continue, it will also support the broader efforts of Paths to Understanding, our supporting parent nonprofit organization.